put aside thoughts of Fail reluctantly. With time, he could puzzle it out. He had to, somehow. It is their way, Aram. Aram grimaced, as if he might spit. Well, it isn't a decent way. It keeps them under control, I suppose. Nobody would run far and make trouble like that. But it isn't decent. There were Aiel all over the place, of course. Tall, aloof men in grays and browns and greens. Their only bit of color, the scarlet strip of cloth tied around their temples, with the black and white disc on their foreheads. Siswayaman, they called themselves. Sometimes that word tickled the edge of his memory like a word he should know. Ask one of the Aielmen, and he looked as if you had babbled nonsense. But then they ignored the strips of cloth, too. No maiden of the spear wore the scarlet headband. Whether white-haired or looking barely old enough to leave her mother, every maiden stalked about giving the Siswayaman challenging stares that seemed somehow self-satisfied, while the men looked back flat-eyed with a smell almost of hunger, a matter of jealousy by the scent of all of them, though over what Perrin could not begin to imagine. Whatever it was not new, and it did not seem likely to come to blows. A few of the wise ones were inside the wagons as well, in bulky skirts and white blouses, wearing their dark shawls in defiance of the heat, glittering bracelets and necklaces of gold and ivory making up for the plainness of the rest of their clothes. Some appeared amused by the maidens and the
Fishing Studios, how you doing,
and
bro?
others exasperated.
Since you're here,
All
let's
of
do
them,
a dab.
wise ones, maidens, and Siswayaman, ignored the Shido the way Perrin would of a stool or a rug. The Aiel had taken 200 or so Shido prisoners yesterday, men and maidens, not many considering the numbers involved, and they moved about freely, in a manner of speaking. Perrin would have been a lot more comfortable had they been guarded and clothed. Instead, they fetched water and ran errands, naked as the day they were born. With other Aiel, they were meek as mice. Anyone else received a proudly defiant stare for noticing them. Perrin was not the only one who tried not to notice them, and Aram not the only one to mutter.
Studios.
A good many of the Two Rivers men in camp did one or both. A good many of the Carianan nearly had apoplexy whenever they saw one of the Shido. The Mayenners just shook their heads as though it were all a joke, and ogled the women. They had as little shame as the Aiel, the Mayenners. Gaul explained it to me, Aram. You know what a Gaishain is, don't you? About Giotto and serving a year and a day and all that? The other man nodded, which was a good thing. Perrin did not know much himself. Gaul's explanations of Aiel ways often left him more confused. Gaul always thought it all self-evident. Well, Gaishain aren't allowed to wear anything one of the Algaid Siswai might wear. That means spear fighters, he added at Aram's questioning frown. Suddenly he realized he was looking straight at one of the Shido and trotted in his general direction. A tall young woman, golden-haired and pretty despite a long, thin scar down her cheek and other scars elsewhere. Very pretty and very naked. Clearing his throat roughly, he pulled his eyes away. He could feel his face heating. Anyway, that is why they are where they are. Gaishain wear white robes, and they don't have any here. It's just their way. Burn Gaul and burn his explanations, he thought. They could tell him with something. Perrin Golden Eyes, said a woman's voice. Water here says to know whether you wish water. Aram's face went purple, and he jerked himself around in his squat, presenting his back to her. No, thank you. Perrin did not need to look up to know it was the golden-haired Shido woman. He kept peering off at nothing in another direction. Aiel had a peculiar sense of humor, and maidens of the spear, Carachwin was a maiden, had the most peculiar. They had quickly seen how the Wetlanders reacted to the Shido. They would have needed to be blind not to. And suddenly Gaishain were being sent to Wetlanders left and right, and Aiel all but rolling on the ground at the blushes and stammers, and even the shouting. He was sure that Carowin and her friends were watching now. This was at least the 10th time one of the Gaishain women came to ask him whether he wanted water or a whetstone, or some such bloody fool thing. Abruptly, a thought struck him. The Mayenners were seldom bothered this way. A handful of Cariennen plainly enjoyed looking, if not so openly as the Mayenners, and some of the older Two Rivers men, who should have known better. The point was, none of them had had a second spurious message that he knew of. Those who reacted the most, on the other hand, Cariennen, who had shouted the loudest about indecency, and 2 or 3 of the younger Two Rivers men, who stammered and blushed so hard they looked ready to melt, had been pestered until they fled the wagons entirely. With an effort, Perrin looked up at the Gaishain's face, at her eyes. Focus on her eyes, he thought frantically. They were green and large and not at all meek. Her scent was pure fury. Thank Carowin for me, and tell her you could oil my spare saddle if she doesn't mind. And I don't have a clean shirt. If she wouldn't mind you doing some laundry. She will not mind, the woman said in a tight voice, then turned and trotted off. Perrin whipped his eyes away, though the image did stay in his head. Light Aram was right. But with luck, he might just have stopped any more visitations. He would have to point this out to Aram and the Two Rivers men. Maybe the Cariennen would listen too. What are we going to do about it, Lord Perrin? Still looking away, Aram no longer spoke of Gaishain. That is Rand's to decide, Perrin said slowly, satisfaction fading. It might be odd to think of people wandering about naked as a small problem, but this was definitely a bigger. And one he had been avoiding as hard as he had what lay to the north. On the far side of the wagon circle, nearly 24 women sat on the ground. All well-dressed for travel, many wore silk, most with light linen dust cloaks, but not a bead of sweat showed on any face. 3 appeared young enough that he might have asked them for a dance before he married Fail. If they weren't Aes Sedai, anyway, he thought wryly. Once he had danced with an Aes Sedai, and he swallowed his tongue when he realized who he swung about. And she had been a friend, if that word applied to Aes Sedai. How new does an Aes Sedai have to be for me to put an age to her? The others looked ageless, of course. Maybe in their 20s, maybe their 40s, changing from one glance to the next, always uncertain. That was what their faces said, though several showed gray in their hair. You just could not tell with Aes Sedai. About anything. At least they don't danger anymore, Aram said, jerking his head toward 3 of the sisters, a little apart from the rest. One wept, face on her knees. The other 2 stared haggardly at nothing, one of them plucking aimlessly at her skirt. They had been much the same since yesterday. At least none was screaming any longer. If Perrin had the straight of it, which he was not sure he did, they had been stilled somehow when Rand broke free. They would never channel the one power again. To Aes Sedai, it was probably better to be dead. He would have expected the other Aes Sedai to comfort them, care for them somehow, but most ignored the 3 entirely, although a little too studied in looking anywhere and everywhere else. For that matter, the stilled Aes Sedai refused to acknowledge the rest either. In the beginning, at least, a few of the other sisters had approached, each by herself, calm to the eye, yet smelling sharply of aversion and reluctance. But they got nothing for their pains, word or glance. None had gone near this morning. Perrin shook his head. The Aes Sedai seemed to do a lot of ignoring of what they did not want to admit. For instance, the black-coated men standing over them. There was an Ashaman for each sister, even the 3 who had been stilled, and they never seemed to blink. For their part, the Aes Sedai looked past the Ashaman, or through them. They might as well not have existed. It was quite a trick. He could not make himself disregard the Ashaman, and he was not under their guard. They ranged from fuzz-cheeked boys to gray-haired, balding Gansers, and it was not their grim, high-collared black coats or the sword each wore at his hip that made them dangerous. Every Ashaman could channel, and somehow they were keeping the Aes Sedai from channeling. Men who could wield the one power, a thing of nightmares. Rand could, of course, but he was Rand, and the Dragon Reborn besides. These fellows made Perrin's hackles rise. The captive Aes Sedai's surviving warders sat some distance off, under their own guard. 30 or so of Lord Dobrain's armsmen in bell-shaped Carianan helmets, and as many Mayenner winged guards in red breastplates, each sharp-eyed as if guarding leopards. A good attitude under the circumstances. More warders than there were Aes Sedai. A number of the prisoners were Green Aja, apparently. More guards than warders, a good many more, and maybe few enough at that. The lights send we don't see any more grief from that lot, Perrin muttered. Twice during the night, the warders had tried to break free. In truth, those outbreaks had been suppressed more by the Ashaman than by the Carianan or Mayenners, and they had not been gentle. None of the warders had been killed, but at least a dozen nursed broken bones. None of the sisters had yet been allowed to heal. If the Lord Dragon cannot make the decision, Aram said quietly, maybe it should be made by somebody else, to protect him. Perrin gave him a sidelong look. What decision? The sisters told them not to make another attempt, and they'll obey their Aes Sedai. Broken bones or no, unarmed as they were, hands tied behind their backs, the warders still looked like a wolf pack awaiting the lead wolf's command to attack. None would rest easy until his Aes Sedai was free, maybe until all of the sisters were free. Aes Sedai and warders. A stack of well-aged oak ready for a flame. But even warders and Aes Sedai had proved no match for Ashaman. I did not mean the warders. Aram hesitated, then shuffled closer to Perrin and lowered his voice further, to a hoarse whisper. The Aes Sedai kidnapped the Lord Dragon. He can't trust them, not ever. But he won't do what he has to, either. If they died before he knew it. What are you saying? Perrin almost choked as he sat bolt upright. Not for the first time, he wondered whether there was any tinker left in the other man. They're helpless, Aram. Helpless women. They are Aes Sedai. Dark eyes met Perrin's golden stare levelly. They cannot be trusted, and they cannot be turned loose. How long can Aes Sedai be held against their will? They've been doing what they do far longer than the Ashaman. They must know more. They're a danger to the Lord Dragon and to you, Lord Perrin. I have seen them look at you. Across the wagon circle, the sisters were talking among themselves in whispers even Perrin could not hear, mouths held close to ears. And one did look at him and Aram. At him, not Aram. He had caught a double handful of names, Nasum Dahara, Arian Barolios, and Katarine Aradn, Koiran Saildane, Sareen Nemdal, and Elza Penfell, Janine Pavlara, Beldine Nairam, Merith Riven. Those last were the young sisters, but young or ageless. They watched him with faces so serene, it seemed they had the upper hand despite the Ashaman. Defeating Aes Sedai was not easy. Making them admit defeat lay on the far side of impossible. He forced his hands to unknot and rest on his knees, giving an appearance of calm he was nowhere near feeling. They knew he was Taviran, one of those few the pattern would shape itself around for a time. Worse, they knew he was tied to Rand in some way nobody understood, least of all himself or Rand. Or Matt. Matt was in that tangle too, another Taviran, though neither of them as strongly as Rand. Given half a chance, those women would have him and Matt inside the White Tower as fast as they would Rand, tethered like goats until the lion came. And they had kidnapped Rand, mistreated him. Aram was right about one thing. They could not be trusted. But what Aram suggested, he would not, could not, countenance such a thing. The thought made him queasy. "I'll hear no more of that," he growled. The one-time tinker opened his mouth, but Perrin cut him off. "Not a word, Aram, do you hear me? Not one word." "As my Lord Perrin commands," Aram muttered, inclining his head. Perrin wished he could see the man's face. There was no anger in the smell of him, no resentment. That was the worst of it. There had been no anger sent even when Aram suggested murder. A pair of Two Rivers men climbed up on the wheels of the next wagon, peering across the wagon bed and down the hill toward the north. Each wore a bristling quiver on his right hip and a stout, long-bladed knife, almost a short sword, on his left. A good 300 men from home had followed Perrin here. He cursed the first to call him Lord Perrin, cursed the day he had stopped trying to quash it. Even with the rumors and noises usual in a camp this size, he had no trouble hearing the pair. Todd Alcar, a year younger than Perrin, let out a long breath as if seeing what lay below for the first time. Perrin could almost sense the lanky man's lantern jaw working. Todd's mother had willingly let him go, only for the honor of her son following Perrin Golden Eyes. "A famous victory," Todd said finally. "That's what we won. Wasn't it, John Dinn?" Grizzled John Dinn Barron, gnarled as an oak root, was one of the few older men among the 300. A better bow shot than anyone in the Two Rivers except Master Althor, and a better hunter than anyone at all, he was one of the Two Rivers' less distinguished residents. John Dinn had not worked a day more than he had to since he was old enough to leave his father's farm. The forests and the hunt were all he cared about. That and drinking too much at feast days. Now he spoke loudly. "If you say so, boy. Was those bloody Ashaman wanted anyway? And welcome to it, I say. Too bad they don't take it and go someplace else to celebrate." "They aren't so bad," Todd protested. "I wouldn't mind being one myself." That sounded more boast and bluff than truth. He smelled it, too. But Perrin was sure he was licking his lips. Likely Todd's mother had used tales of men who could channel to frighten him not so many years ago. "I mean to say Rand. That is, the Dragon Reborn. It still sounds odd, doesn't it? Randall Thor being the Dragon Reborn and all?" Todd laughed, a short, uneasy sound. "Well, he can channel, and it doesn't seem so... He doesn't... I mean..." He swallowed loudly. "Besides, what could we have done about all those Aes Sedai without them?" That came out in a whisper. He smelled afraid now. "Jondon, what are we going to do? I mean, Aes Sedai prisoners?" The older man spat again, louder than before. He did not bother to lower his voice either. Jondon always said what he thought, no matter who. Another reason for his bad repute. "Better for us if they'd all died yesterday, boy. We'll pay for that before it's done. Mark me, we'll pay large." Perrin shut out the rest. No easy task with his ears. First Aram, and now Jondon and Todd, if not so directly. Burn Jondon. No, the man might make Matt look industrious, but if he spoke it, others thought it. No Two Rivers man would willingly harm a woman, but who else wished the Aes Sedai prisoners dead? And who might try to achieve it? He scanned the wagon circle uneasily. The thought that he might have to protect the Aes Sedai prisoners was not pleasant, but he did not shirk it. He had little fondness for any Aes Sedai, least of all for these. But he had grown up in the unspoken certainty that a man would put himself at risk to protect a woman as far as she allowed. Whether he liked her or even knew her was beside the point. True, an Aes Sedai could tie any man she chose into a knot 9 ways from next feast day, but cut off from the power, they became like anyone else.
I always smoke before bed, just
that was the struggle whenever he looked at them.
At least to me, I feel it helps.
24 Aes Sedai. 24 women who might not know how to defend themselves without the power. For a bit, he studied the Ashaman guards, everyone wearing a face like grim death, except the three overseeing the stilled women. They tried to appear as somber as the rest, but under the attempt lay something else. Satisfaction, maybe.
It's a
only he was
little
close enough
chilly
to catch a scent
outside,
of
but let's
them.
see what it actually is.
Any Aes Sedai was a threat to the Ashaman.
Oh, well, I
Perhaps the
guess it
reverse
is
was true, too.
a little chilly.
Perhaps they would only still them. From the little he had picked up,
It's 55
stilling an Aes Sedai
degrees
amounted
out.
to a killing that
So it
just
is a
took a
little
few
chilly.
years for the corpse to lie down. Whatever the case, he decided reluctantly he had to leave the Ashaman to Rand. They spoke only to each other and the prisoners, and Perrin doubted they would listen to anyone but Rand.
Well, what's funny
The
is I
question
still
was,
have
what would Rand say?
my AC on.
And what could Perrin do if he said the wrong
But
thing?
mainly because
Putting that problem aside, he
my
scratched
room's
his beard with
small,
one finger.
so
The
if I don't
Karianan
have
were
that
too
on,
nervous about Aes Sedai to consider harming them.
I wouldn't
And
have
the
been able
Manners
to
too
sleep in here
respectful,
that good just because it'll
but he
get
would
so
keep an
hot
eye
in
on
here.
them anyway. Who would have thought Jondon would go as far as he had?
Although I
Among
do
the
have
Karianan
it
or
on,
Mayors
not
who
so much
possessed
the
some
AC
influence,
part as
though it would surely vanish
or the
if they
fan
once
part, so
thought.
it's blowing the cool air from outside in.
He was really just a blacksmith, after all. That left the Aiel
Because there was one time
inside.
my AC went
He
out.
was
I
not
had
certain how much influence even Rand
replaced
truly had
the
with the
plug
Aiel.
outlet behind me.
It was
right
difficult picking out individual scents with so many people around, but he had grown used to telling
And,
as much by smells as by
Here.
what
Even
his
with my
eyes
door
told him.
open, I
The
still couldn't
Siswayaman, who
really
came close enough, smelled calm
get
but
to
alert.
sleep because it was
a
just
smooth,
too
strong
stuffy and
They hardly appeared to notice
warm
the
in
Aes
here.
Sedai.
or hot.
The maiden's aromas were spiky with suppressed fury, and grew spikier when they looked at the prisoners. And the wise ones? Every wise one who had come here from Carian was able to channel, though none had the ageless face. He supposed they used the one power too seldom. Still, smooth-cheeked like Adara, or as leathery-faced
this
as
one.
white-haired Soralia, they carried themselves
small-
with a
small ones I
self-possession
got.
easily matching the Aes Sedai.
This one, it's a Dr. Dabber
Graceful
XS,
women for the most part,
and then
most
I
of them
got
tall,
the
as
Luca
nearly all
Dragon
Aiel
egg.
were.
Because
They
my
seemed to ignore the sisters
my
completely.
Dr. Dabber switch, my big one.
Soralia's eyes passed across the prisoners
Yes.
without pausing, and she went right on talking softly to
Out
Adara
of
and
commission
another
right
wise
now.
one, a lean, yellow-haired woman he did not know by name.
I gotta replace the
If only he
carb
could
cap.
make out what they were saying. They walked by, not a line changing on those three unruffled faces, but their scents were another matter. When Soralia's gaze swept over the Aes Sedai, the smell of her went cold and distant, grim and purposeful. And as she spoke to the other two, their scents changed to match hers. "A fine bloody stew," he growled. "Trouble?" Aram asked, sitting up straighter on his heels, right hand poised apart for the wolf-head pommeled sword hilt jutting above his shoulder. He had become very good with that sword in a very short time, and he was never loath to use it. "There's no trouble, Aram." That was not quite a lie. Jolted out of his glum brooding, Perrin really looked at the others for the first time. At all of them together. He did not like what he saw, and the Aes Sedai were only part. Karianan and Mayenners watched Aiel suspiciously, which was no more than the Aiel's returned suspicion, especially toward the Karianan. No real surprise there. Aiel did have a certain reputation, after all, for being none too friendly to anyone born this side of the spine of the world, Karianan least of all. Simple truth was, Aiel and Karianan hated each other about as hard as it was possible to hate. Neither side had really put their enmity aside. The best that could be said was that it was on a loose leash. Yet up to now, he had been convinced they would hold it in. For Rand's sake, if no other reason. A mood hung in the camp, though, a tension that had wound everyone tight. Rand was free now, and temporary alliances were just that, after all. Temporary. Aiel hefted their spears when they looked at the Karianan, and the Karianan grimly fingered their swords. So did the Mayenners. They had no quarrel with the Aiel, had never fought them, except for the Aiel War, when everybody had. But if it came to a fight, there was little doubt which side they would be on. The Two Rivers men, too, probably. The dark mood had settled deepest in the Ashaman and the Wise Ones, though. The black-coated men paid no more heed to the maidens and the Siswayaman than to Karienin or Mayaners or Two Rivers. But they studied the Wise Ones with faces almost as dark as those directed at the Aes Sedai. Very likely they made small distinction between one woman who could wield the power and another. Any could be an enemy and dangerous. 13 together were deadly dangerous, and they were better than 90 Wise Ones in the camp or nearby. Fewer than half the number of Ashaman, but still enough to do damage if they chose. Women who could channel, yet they seemed to follow Rand. They seemed to follow Rand, yet they were women who could channel. The Wise Ones looked at the Ashaman only a trifle less coldly than they did the Aes Sedai. The Ashaman were men who could channel, but they followed Rand. They followed Rand, but Rand was a special case. According to Gaul, his channeling was not mentioned in the prophecies about their Karakarn, but the Aiel seemed to pretend that inconvenient fact did not exist. The Ashaman were not in those prophecies at all, though. It must be like discovering you had a pride of rabid lions fighting on your side.
Hey, Christopher, how you doing, bro?
How long would they remain loyal? Maybe it would be better to put them down now.
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien.
Oh. His head fell back against the wagon wheel, eyes closed, and his chest heaved in silent, mirthless laughter. Think of the good things on High Chazeline. Thought Riley. I should have gone with Rand. No, it was best to know, and better soon than late. But what in the light was he to do? If the Aiel and the Karienin and Mayaners turned on one another, or worse, the Ashaman and the Wise Ones, a barrel full of snakes, and the only way to find out which were vipers was to stick your hand in. Light, I wish I was home with Fail and a forge to work and nobody calling me Bloody Lord. Your horse, Lord Perrin. You didn't say whether you wanted stepper or stayer, so I saddled. At Perrin's golden-eyed glare, Kenley Merrin shied back into the dun stallion he was leading. Perrin made a soothing gesture. Not Kenley's fault. What could not be mended had to be endured. Easy, lad. You did right. Stepper will do just fine. You chose well. He hated speaking to Kenley that way. Short and stocky, Kenley was barely old enough to marry or leave home. Certainly not old enough for the patchy beard he was trying to cultivate in imitation of Perrin. Yet he had fought Trollocs at Emmons Field and done well yesterday. But he grinned broadly at praise from Lord Perrin Bloody Golden Eyes. Rising, Perrin took his axe from where he had propped it under the wagon, out of sight and for a little while out of mind, and thrust the haft through the loop on his belt. A heavy half-moon blade balanced by a thick curving spike, a thing made for no other purpose than killing. The axe haft felt too familiar to his hands for comfort. Did he even remember what a good forge hammer felt like? There were other things besides Lord Perrin that it might be too late to change. A friend had once told him to keep the axe until he began to like using it.
I'm just
The thought made him shiver in spite of the heat.
relaxing.
He swung into Stepper's saddle, shadowed by Aram with the gray, and sat facing south into the wagon circle. At least half again as tall as even the tallest of the Aiel, Loyal was just stepping carefully over crossed wagon tongues. With the size of him, he did look as though he might break one of the heavy wooden shafts with a heedless step. As usual, the Ogier had a book in his hand, a thick finger marking his place, and the capacious pockets of his long coat bulged with more. He had spent the morning in a tiny clump of trees he called restful and shady, but whatever the shade among those trees, the heat was affecting him too. He looked tired, and his coat was undone, his shirt unlaced, and his boots rolled down below his knees. Or maybe it was more than the heat. Just inside the wagons, Loyal paused, peering at the Aes Sedai and the Ashaman. and his tufted ears quivered uneasily. Eyes big as teacups rolled toward the wise ones, and his ears vibrated again. Ogier were sensitive to the mood of a place. When he saw Perrin, Loyal came striding across the camp.
Maybe.
Sitting his saddle, Perrin was 2 or 3 hands shorter than Loyal standing.
Perrin,
Loyal whispered.
this is all wrong. It isn't right. And it is dangerous besides.
For an Ogier, it was a whisper. He sounded like a bumblebee the size of a mastiff. Some of the Aes Sedai turned their heads. Could you speak a little louder? Perrin said, almost under his breath. I think somebody in Andor didn't hear. In the west of Andor. Loyal looked startled, then grimaced, long eyebrows brushing his cheeks.
I do know how to whisper, you know.
This time it was unlikely anyone could hear clearly more than 3 paces away or so.
What are we going to do, Perrin? It is wrong holding Aes Sedai against their will. Wrong, and wrong-headed too. I have said that before, and I will again. And that isn't even the worst. The feel here. One spark, and this place will erupt like a wagon load of fireworks. Does Rand know about this?
I don't know, Perrin said to both questions, and after a moment the Ogier nodded reluctantly.
Someone has to know, Perrin. Someone has to do something.
Loyal looked north, over the wagons behind Perrin, and Perrin knew there was no putting it off longer. Unwillingly, he turned stepper. He would rather have worried over Aes Sedai and Asherman and Wise Ones till his hair fell out. But what had to be done had to be done. Think of the good on High Chazaline. Chapter 2. The Butcher's Yard. At first, Perrin did not look downslope toward where he would ride, where he should have gone with Rand this morning. Instead, he sat his saddle at the edge of the wagons and sent his eyes anywhere else, though the view everywhere made him want to sick up. It was like being hit in the belly with a hammer. Hammerstroke. 19 fresh graves atop a squat hill to the east. 19 Two Rivers men who would never see home again. A blacksmith seldom had to see people die because of his decisions. At least the Two Rivers men had obeyed his orders. There would have been more graves otherwise. Hammerstroke. Rectangles of newly turned earth blanketed the next slope over from that as well. Near to 100 Mayenners and more Karienen, who had come to Dumai's wells to die. Never mind causes or reasons. They had followed Perrin Ebara. Hammerstroke. The ridge face to the west seemed solid graves, maybe 1,000 or more. 1,000 Aiel, buried standing upright to face each sunrise. 1,000. Some were maidens. The men tied his stomach into knots. The women made him want to sit down and cry. He tried telling himself that they had all chosen to be here, that they had to be here. Both things were true, but he had given the orders, and that made the responsibility for those graves his. Not Rand's, not the Aes Sedai's, his. The living Aiel had only stopped singing over their dead a short while ago, haunting songs, sung in parts that lingered in the mind. Life is a dream that knows no shade. Life is a dream of pain and woe. A dream from which we pray to wake, a dream from which we wake and go. Who would sleep when the new dawn waits? Who would sleep when the sweet winds blow? A dream must end when the new day comes. This dream from which we wake and go. They appeared to find comfort in those songs. He wished he could too, but as far as he could see, the Aiel truly did not seem to care whether they lived or died, and that was mad. Any sane man wanted to live. Any sane man would run as far as he could from a battle, run as hard as he could. Stepper tossed his head, nostrils flaring at the smells from below, and Perrin patted the Dun's neck. Aram was grinning as he looked at what Perrin tried to block out. Loyal's face had so little expression it might have been carved from wood. His lips moved slightly, and Perrin thought he heard,
Light, let me never see the like again.
Drawing a deep breath, he made his eyes follow theirs to Dumai's wells. In some ways, it was not as bad as the graves. He had known some of those people since he was a child. But it all crashed down on him at once anyway, like the scent in his nose made solid and smashing him between the eyes. The memories he wanted to forget came rushing back. Dumai's wells had been a killing ground, a dying ground, but now it was worse. Less than a mile away, the charred remains of wagons stood around a small copse of trees, nearly hiding the low stone copings of the wells. And surrounding that, a seething sea of black, vultures and ravens and crows in tens of thousands, swirling up in waves and settling down again, concealing the broken, for which Perrin was more than grateful. The Ashaman's methods had been reviewed, destroying flesh and ground with equal impartiality. Too many Shido had died to bury in less than days, even had anyone cared to bury them. So the vultures gorged, and the ravens, and the crows. The dead wolves were down there too. He had wanted to bury them, but that was not the wolves' way. 3 Aes Sedai corpses had been found, their channeling unable to save them from spears and arrows in the madness of battle, and half a dozen dead warders too. They were buried in the clearing near the wells. The birds were not alone with the dead. Far from it. Black-feathered waves rose around Lord Dobraine Tabrowen, and over 200 of his mounted Carianan armsmen, and Lieutenant Javier Nurella, with all that remained of his Mayenners aside from the guards and the warders. Khan, with 2 white diamonds on blue, picked out the Carianan officers, all but Dobraine himself, and the Mayenners' red armor and red streamered lances made a brave show amid the carnage. But Dobraine was not the only one who held a cloth to his nose. Here and there a man leaned from the saddle, trying to empty a stomach already emptied earlier. Mazrim Taim, almost as tall as Rand, was afoot in his black coat with the blue and gold dragons climbing the sleeves, and maybe 100 more of the Ashaman. Some of them heaved up their bellies too. They were maidens by the score, more Siswayaman than Carianan and Mayenners and Ashaman combined, and several dozen wise ones to boot. All supposedly in case the Shido returned, or perhaps in case some of the dead were only shamming, though Perrin thought anyone who pretended of being a corpse here would soon go insane. All centered around Rand. Perrin should have been down there with the 2 Rivers men. Rand had asked for them, spoken about trusting men from home, but Perrin had made no promises. He'll have to settle for me, and late, he thought. In a little bit, when he managed to steel himself to the butcher's yard below. Only butcher knives did not mow down people, and they were tidier than axes, tidier than vultures. The black-coated Ashaman faded into the sea of birds, death swallowed by death, and ravens and crows surging up hid the others. But Rand stood out in the tattered white shirt he had been wearing when rescue came. Though perhaps he hardly needed deliverance by that time. The sight of Min, close beside Rand in pale red coat and snug breeches, made Perrin grimace. That was no place for her, or anyone. But she stayed closer to Rand since the rescue than even Taim did. Somehow Rand had managed to free both himself and her well before Perrin broke through, or even the Ashaman, and Perrin suspected she saw Rand's presence as the only real safety. Sometimes, as he rode across that charnel ground, Rand patted Min's arm or bent his head as if speaking to her, but not with his main attention. Dark clouds of birds billowed around them, the smaller darting away to feed elsewhere, the vultures giving ground reluctantly, some refusing to take wing, extending featherless necks and squawking defiantly as they waddled back. Now and then Rand stopped, bending over a corpse. Sometimes fire darted from his hands to strike down vultures that did not give way. Every time, Nandera, who led the maidens, or Suolin, her second, argued with him. Sometimes wise ones did too, from the way they tugged at the body's coat as if demonstrating something. And Rand would nod and move on. Not without backward glances, though, and only until another body caught his attention. "What is he doing?" demanded a haughty voice at Perrin's knee. By scent, he knew her before he looked down. Statuesque and elegant in a green silk riding dress and thin linen dust cloak, Karuna Nachaman was sister to King Paitar of Arafel, and a powerful noble in her own right, and becoming Aes Sedai had done nothing to dampen her manner. Trapped in what he was watching, he had not heard her approach. "Why is he down in that? He should not be." Not all the Aes Sedai in the camp were prisoners, though those who were not had been keeping out of sight since yesterday, talking among themselves, Perrin suspected, and trying to figure out what had happened at the last. Maybe trying to figure out some way around it. Now they were out in force. Bera Harkin, another green, stood at Karuna's shoulder, a farm wife by looks despite her ageless face and fine woolen dress, but every scrap as proud as Karuna in her own way. This farm wife would tell a king to scrape his boots before coming into her house and be sharp about it. She and Karuna together led the sisters who had come to demise wells with Perrin, or perhaps passed leadership back and forth between them. It was not exactly clear, which was hardly unusual with Aes Sedai. The other 7 stood in a covey not far away, or maybe in a pride. Lionesses, not quail, by their air of being in charge. Their warders were arrayed behind them, and if the sisters were all outward serenity, the warders made no bones of their feelings. They were disparate men, some in those color-shifting cloaks that seemed to make parts of them disappear, but whether short or tall, thick or thin, just standing there, they looked like violence on a frayed leash. Perrin knew 2 of those women well, Varen Mathwin and Alana Mosvani. Short and stout and almost motherly at times in a distracted way, when she was not studying you like a bird studying a worm, Varen was brown Arja. Alana, slim and darkly pretty, though a little haggard around the eyes of late for some reason, was green. Altogether, 5 of the 9 were green. Once, some time ago, Varen had told him not to trust Alana too far, and he more than took her at her word. Nor did he trust any of the others, including Varen. Neither did Rand, for all they had fought on his side yesterday, and despite what had happened at the end, which Perrin still was not sure he believed, even though he had seen it. A good dozen Ashaman lounged by a wagon about 20 paces from the sisters. A cocky fellow named Charles Gedwin had charge of them this morning, a hard-faced man who swaggered standing still. All wore a pin in the shape of a silver sword on their tall coat collars, and 4 or 5 besides Gedwin had a dragon in gold and red enamel fastened on the other side. Perrin supposed that had to do with rank in some way. He had seen both on some of the other Ashaman. Not precisely guards, they managed to be wherever Karuna and the others were, just taking their ease and keeping a sharp eye open. Not that the Aes Sedai took any notice, not that you could see. Even so, the sisters smelled wary and puzzled and infuriated. Part of that had to be because of the Ashaman. "Well?" Karuna's dark eyes flashed impatience. He doubted that many people kept her waiting. "I don't know," he lied, patting Stepper's neck again. "Rand doesn't tell me everything." He understood a little, he thought he did, but he had no intention of telling anyone. That was Rand's to reveal, if he chose. Every body that Rand looked at belonged to a maiden. Perrin was convinced of it. A Shido maiden without a doubt, but he was not sure how much difference that made to Rand. Last night he had walked away from the wagons to be by himself, and as the sound of men laughing, because they were alive, faded behind him, he found Rand. the dragon reborn who made the world tremble, sitting on the ground, alone in the dark, his arms wrapped around himself, rocking back and forth. To Perrin's eyes, the moon was nearly as good as the sun, but right then he wished for pitch blackness. Rand's face was drawn and twisted, the face of a man who wanted to scream, or maybe weep, and was fighting it down with every scrap of his fiber. Whatever trick the Aes Sedai knew to keep the heat from touching them, Rand and the Ashaman knew too, but he was not using it now. The night's heat would have done for a more than warm summer day, and sweat slid down Rand's cheeks as much as Perrin's. He did not look around, though Perrin's boots rustled loudly in the dead grass. Yet he spoke hoarsely, still rocking. 151, Perrin. 151 maidens died today. For me. I promised them, you see. Don't argue with me. Shut up. Go away. Despite his sweat, Rand shivered. Not you, Perrin. Not you. I have to keep my promises, you see. Have to, no matter how it hurts. But I have to keep my promise to myself, too. No matter how it hurts. Perrin tried not to think about the fate of men who could channel. The lucky ones died before they went mad. The unlucky died after. Whether Rand was lucky or unlucky, everything rested on him. Everything. Rand, I don't know what to say, but... Rand seemed not to hear. Back and forth he rocked, back and forth. Isan, of the Jara Sept of the Charin Aiel. She died for me today. Chuanda of the Spine Ridge Miagoma. She died for me today. Ajarin of the Shilan Darain. There had been nothing for it but to settle on his heels and listen to Rand recite all 151 names in a voice like pain stretched to breaking. Listen and hope Rand was holding on to sanity. Whether or not Rand was still completely sane, though, if a maiden who came to fight for him had been missed down there somehow, Perrin was sure that not only would she be buried decently with the others on the ridge, there would be 152 names in that list. And that was none of Karuna's business. Not that, or Perrin's doubts. Rand had to stay sane, or sane enough anyway. And that was that. Light sent it so. And the light burned me for thinking it so coldly, Perrin thought. From the corner of his eye, he saw her full mouth tighten momentarily. She liked not knowing everything about as well as being made to wait. She would have been beautiful in a grand sort of manner, except that hers was a face used to getting what it wanted. Not petulant, just absolutely certain that whatever she wanted was right and proper and must be. With so many crows and ravens in one place, there are certainly hundreds, perhaps thousands, ready to report what they've seen to a murdral. She made no effort to mask her irritation. She sounded as though he had brought every bird there himself. In the borderlands, we kill them on sight. You have men, and they have bows. It was true. A raven or crow was all too likely to be a spy for the Shadow, but disgust welled up in him. Disgust and weariness. To what point? With that many birds, the two Riversmen and the Aiel could shoot every arrow they had, and spies would still report. Most times, there was no way to tell whether the bird you killed was the spy or the one that flew away. Hasn't there been enough killing? There will be more soon enough. Light woman, even the Ashaman are sated. Eyebrows rose among the onlooking clutch of sisters. No one spoke to Aes Sedai that way, not a king or a queen. Vera gave him a look that said she was considering hauling him out of the saddle and boxing his ears. Still peering toward the shambles below, Karuna smoothed her skirts, her face coldly determined. Loyal's ears trembled. He had a deep but uneasy respect for Aes Sedai. Close to twice as tall as most of the sisters, sometimes he behaved as though one might step on him without noticing if he got in her way. Perrin gave Karuna no chance to speak. Give an Aes Sedai a finger, and she took your whole arm. Unless she decided to take more. You've been staying clear of me, but I have a few things to say to you. You disobeyed orders yesterday. If you want to call it changing the plan, he pushed on when she opened her mouth, then call it that. If you think that makes it better. She and the other 8 had been told to stay with the Wise Ones, well back from the actual fighting, guarded by the Two Rivers men and the Mayenners. Instead, they had plunged right into the thick of it, wading in where men were trying to cut one another into dog meat with swords and spears. You took Javi and Norella with you, and half the Mayenners died for it. You don't go your own way with no regard anymore. I won't see men die because you suddenly think you see a better way, and the Dark One take what everyone else thinks. Do you understand me? Are you finished, farm boy? Karuna's voice was dangerously calm. The face she turned up to him might have been carved from some dark ice, and she reeked of affront. Standing on the ground, she somehow made it seem that she was looking down at him. Not an Aes Sedai trick, that. He had seen Fail do it. He suspected most women knew how. I will tell you something, though the meanest intelligence should be able to reason it out. By the 3 oaths, no sister may use the One Power as a weapon except against shadow spawn, or in defense of her life, or that of her warders, or another sister. We could have stood where you would have had us, and watched until Tarman Gaten without ever being able to do anything effective. Not until we were in danger ourselves. I do not like having to explain my actions, farm boy. Do not make me do it again. Do you understand? Loyal's ears wilted, and he stared straight ahead so hard that it was plain he wished he were anywhere but here, even with his mother, who wanted to marry him off. Aram's mouth hung open, and he always tried to pretend Aes Sedai did not impress him at all. Jondon and Todd climbed down from their wagon wheel just a touch too casually. Jondon managed to stroll away, but Todd ran, looking back over his shoulder. Her explanation sounded reasonable. It was probably the truth. No, by another of the 3 oaths, it was the truth. There were loopholes, though, like not speaking the whole truth, or talking around it. The sisters might well have put themselves in danger so they could use the power as a weapon, but Perrin would eat his boots if they had not also been thinking they could reach Rand before anybody else. What would have happened then was anyone's guess, but he was certain their plans had not included anything like what actually happened.
He's coming,
Loyal said suddenly.
Look, Rand is coming.
Dropping to a whisper, he added,
Be careful, Perrin.
For an Ogier, it truly was a whisper. Aram and Karuna probably heard quite clearly, and maybe Bera, but certainly no one besides.
They did not swear anything to you.
His voice went back to its normal boom.
Do you think he might talk to me about what went on inside the camp? For my book?
He was writing a book about the Dragon Reborn, or at least taking notes for one.
I really didn't see much once the fighting began.
He had been at Perrin's side in the thick of it, wielding an axe with a haft nearly as long as he was tall. It was hard to take note of much else when you were trying to stay alive. If you listened to Loyal, you would think he was always somewhere else when things became dangerous.
Do you think he might, Karuna Sedai?
Karuna and Bera exchanged looks, then without a word glided across the ground to Varen and the others. Peering after him, Loyal heaved a sigh. A wind through caverns.
You really should have a care, Perrin, he breathed. You're always so hasty with your tongue.
He sounded like a bumblebee the size of a cat instead of a mastiff. Perrin thought he might learn to whisper yet, if they spent enough time around Aes Sedai. He motioned the Ogier to be quiet, though, so he could listen. The sisters began talking right away, but not a sound reached Perrin's ears. Clearly, they had erected a barrier with the One Power. Clear to the Ashaman as well. They went from lounging to up on their toes in a heartbeat, every line of them focused on the sisters. Nothing said they had taken hold of Saidin, the male half of the true source, but Perrin would have wagered Stepper they had. By Gedwin's angry sneer, he was ready to use it, too. Whatever obstruction the Aes Sedai had raised, they must have dropped it. They folded their hands, turning to look down the slope in silence. Glances passed among the Ashaman, and finally Gedwin waved them back to apparent indolence. He looked disappointed. Growling irritably, Perrin turned back to look beyond the wagons. Rand was strolling up the slope with Min on his arm, patting her hand and talking with her. Once he threw back his head and laughed, and she ducked hers to do the same, brushing back dark ringlets that hung to her shoulders. You might have thought him a countryman out with his girl, except that he had belted on his sword, and sometimes he ran his hand down the long hilt. And except for Taim right at his other shoulder, and the wise ones following almost as close behind, and the rings of maidens and Siswayaman, Karienin and Mayenners that completed the procession. What a relief that he would not have to ride down into that shambles after all. But he needed to warn Rand about all the tangled enmities he had seen this morning. What would he do if Rand did not listen? Rand had changed since leaving the Two Rivers, most of all since being kidnapped by Coiron and that lot. No, he had to be sane. When Rand and Min entered the wagon circle, most of the procession remained outside, though they hardly came alone, but with quite an assembly in its own right. Taim shadowed Rand, of course, dark and slightly hook-nosed, and what Perrin supposed most women would consider good-looking. A number of the maidens had certainly given him second looks, and third. They were forward about that sort of thing. As Taim stepped inside, he glanced to Gedwin, who shook his head just a hair. A grimace flashed across Taim's face, gone as soon as it appeared. Nandera and Sualin were right at Rand's heels, equally, of course, and Perrin wondered they did not bring 20 more maidens. They hardly seemed to let Rand bathe without maidens guarding the tub, that Perrin could see. He did not understand why Rand put up with it. Each had her shufa draped around her shoulders, bearing short hair cut with a tail at the back. Nandera was a sinewy woman, hair more gray than yellow, but her tough features managed to be handsome, if not beautiful. Sualin, wiry, scarred, leathery, and white-haired, made Nandera look pretty and almost soft. They glanced at the Ashaman, too, without exactly seeming to, then scanned both groups of Aes Sedai just as circumspectly. Nandera's fingers flashed maiden hand talk. Not for the first time, Perrin wished he could understand it. But a maiden would give up the spear to marry a toad before teaching their hand talk to a man. A maiden Perrin had not noticed, sitting on her heels against a wagon a few paces from Gedwin, answered the same way, and so did another, who until that moment had been playing at cat's cradle with a spear sister near the prisoners. Amis brought the wise ones in and took them aside to confer with Sorlia and a few of the others who had stayed inside the wagons. Despite a face too young for her waist-long white hair, Amis was an important woman, second among the wise ones to Sorlia. They used no one-power tricks to shield their talk, but 7 or 8 maidens immediately encircled them and began singing softly to themselves. Some sat, some stood, some squatted on their heels, each by herself and all happenstance. If you were a fool. It seemed to Perrin that he sighed a great deal since he became mixed up with Aes Sedai and wise ones. Maidens, too. Women in general just seemed to give him fits of late. Dobrain and Avienne, leading their horses and minus their soldiers, brought up the rear. Avienne had finally seen a battle. Perrin wondered whether he would be so eager to see the next. About the same age as Perrin, he did not look as young today as the day before yesterday. Dobrain, with the front of his long, mostly gray hair shaved in the style of Karienin soldiers, definitely was not young. And yesterday, definitely, had not been his first battle, yet the truth was he looked older too. And worried. So did Avienne. Their eyes sought out Perrin. Another time, he would have waited to see what they wanted to talk about, but now he slipped from his saddle, tossed Stepper's reins to Aram, and went to Rand. Others were there ahead of him. Only Sulin and Andera held their silence. Karuna and Bera had moved the moment Rand stepped inside the wagons, and as Perrin approached, Karuna was saying grandly to Rand, "You refused healing yesterday, but anyone can see you are still in pain, even if Alana was not ready to leap out of her." She cut off as Bera touched her arm, but she picked up again, almost without pause. "Perhaps you are ready to be healed now?" That had the sound of, "Perhaps you have come to your full senses?" "The matter of the Aes Sedai must be settled without any more delay, Karakan," Amis said formally, right atop Karuna. "They should be given into our care, Rand al'Thor," Soralia added at the same time that Taim spoke. "The Aes Sedai problem does need to be settled, my Lord Dragon. My Ashaman know how to handle them. They can be held at the Black Tower easily." Dark, slightly tilted eyes flickered toward Karuna and Bera, and Perrin realized with a shock that Taim meant all the Aes Sedai, not just those who were prisoners now. For that matter, though Amis and Soralia frowned at Taim, the looks they directed at the two Aes Sedai meant the same. Karuna smiled at Taim, at the Wise Ones, a thin smile to fit her lips. It was maybe a fraction harder when directed at the man in the black coat, but she seemed not to realize his intent yet. It was enough that he was who he was, what he was. "Under the circumstances," she said coolly, "I am certain that Corin Sedai and the others will give me their parole. You have no more need to worry." The others spoke all at once. "These women have no honor," Amis said contemptuously, and this time it was clear she included all of them. "How could their parole mean anything? They are the tongue," Soralia said in a grim voice, as though pronouncing sentence. And Bera frowned at her. Perrin thought there was something in the old tongue. Again, the word seemed almost something he should recognize, but he did not know why it should make the Aes Sedai scowl, or why Sulin should suddenly nod agreement with the Wise One, who went on like a boulder rumbling downhill. "They deserved no better than any other—"
"My Lord Dragon,"
Taim said, as if belaboring the obvious,
"surely you want the Aes Sedai, all of them, in charge of those you trust. Those you know can deal with them, and who better—" "Enough!"
Rand shouted. They fell silent as one, but their reactions were very different. Taim's features went blank, though he smelled of fury. Amis and Soralia exchanged glances and adjusted their shawls in near unison. Their scents were identical too, and matched their faces in pure determination. They wanted what they wanted, and intended to have it, Karakan or no. Looks passed between Karuna and Bera as well, speaking such volumes that Perrin wished he could read them the way his nose read scent.
Let me get this bowl lit.
His eyes saw two serene Aes Sedai in command of themselves,
over here too.
and anything else they wished to be in command of. His nose smelled two women who were anxious and more than a little afraid. Of Taim, he was sure. They still seemed to think they could deal with Rand one way or another, and with the Wise Ones. But Taim and the Ashaman put the fear of the light into them. Min tugged at Rand's shirt sleeve. She had been studying everybody at once, and the scent of her was almost as worried as the sisters. He patted her hand while glaring hard at everyone else, including Perrin when he opened his mouth. Everybody in the camp was watching, from the Two Rivers men to the Aes Sedai prisoners, though only a few Aiel stood close enough to hear anything. People might watch Rand, but they tended to stay clear of him too, if they could. "The Wise Ones will take charge of the prisoners," Rand said at last, and Soralia suddenly smelled so satisfied that Perrin knuckled his nose vigorously. Taim shook his head in exasperation, but Rand rounded on him before he could speak.
Yeah.
He tucked a thumb behind the buckle of his sword belt, a dragon etched and gilded, and his knuckles were white from gripping it. His other hand worked on the dark boar hide of his sword hilt. "The Ashaman are supposed to train and recruit, not stand guard, especially on Aes Sedai." Perrin's hackles stirred as he realized what aroma wafted from Rand when he looked at Taim. hatred touched with fear. Light, he had to be sane. Taim gave a short, reluctant nod.
As you command, my Lord Dragon.
Min glanced uneasily at the black-coated man and moved closer to Rand. Karuna smelled of relief, but with one last glance at Bera, she drew herself up in stubborn certainty. These Aiel women are quite worthy. Some might have done well had they come to the tower, but you cannot simply hand Aes Sedai over to them. It is unthinkable. Bera Sedai and I will... Rand raised a hand, and her words stopped in their tracks. Maybe it was his stare, like blue-gray stone. Or maybe it was what showed clearly through his torn sleeve, one of the red and gold dragons that wound around his forearms. The dragon glittered in the sunlight. Did you swear fealty to me? Karuna's eyes popped as though something had struck her in the pit of her stomach. After a moment, she nodded, however unwillingly. She looked as disbelieving now as she had the day before, when she knelt down there by the wells at battle's end and swore beneath the light and by her hope of salvation and rebirth to obey the dragon reborn and serve him until the last battle had come and gone. Perrin understood her shock. Even without the 3 oaths, had she denied it, he would have doubted his own memories. 9 Aes Sedai, on their knees, faces aghast at the words coming out of their mouths, reeking of disbelief. Right now, Bera's mouth was puckered up as though she had bitten a bad plum. An Aielman joined the small group, a tall man about the same height as Rand, with a weathered face and touches of gray in his dark red hair, who nodded to Perrin and touched Amisa's hand lightly. She might have pressed his hand for a moment in return. Ruark was her husband, but that was about as much affection as Aiel displayed in front of others. He was also clan chief of the Tardar Aiel. He and Gaul were the only 2 men who did not wear the Siswayamon headband. And since last night, he and 1,000 spears had been out scouting in force. A blind man in another country could have sensed the temper around Rand, and Ruark was no fool.
Is this the right moment, Randolphor?
When Rand motioned him to speak, he went on.
The Shido dogs are still fleeing east as fast as they can. I saw men with green coats on horses to the north, but they avoided us. And you said to let them go unless they gave trouble. I think they are hunting any Aes Sedai who escaped. There were several women with them.
Cold blue eyes glanced at the 2 Aes Sedai, Anvil flat and Anvil hard. Once, Ruark had walked lightly around Aes Sedai. Any Aiel had. But that had ended yesterday, if not before. Good news. I'd give almost anything to have Galena, but still, good news. Rand touched the hilt of his sword again, eased the blade in its dark scabbard. The action seemed unconscious. Galena, a Red, had been in charge of the sisters who held him prisoner. And if he was calm about her today, yesterday he had been in a fury that she had gotten away. Even now his calm was icy, the sort that could hide smoldering rage, and his scent made Perrin's skin crawl. They are going to pay. Every one of them. There was nothing to say whether Rand meant the Shido or the Aes Sedai who had escaped, or both. Bera moved her head uneasily, and he turned his attention back to her and Karuna. You swore fealty, and I trust that. He held up his hand, thumb and forefinger nearly touching to show how far. Aes Sedai always know better than anybody else, or so they think. So I trust you to do what I say. But you won't so much as take a bath without my permission, or a wise one's. This time it was Bera who looked as though she had been struck. Her light brown eyes swiveled to Amis and Soralia with astonished indignation, and Karuna quivered with the effort of not doing the same. The 2 wise ones merely shifted their shawls, but once again their aromas were identical. Contentment rolled off them in waves, a very grim contentment. Perrin thought it a good thing the Aes Sedai did not have his nose, or they would have been ready to go to war right then and there. Or maybe run, and dignity be hanged. That was what he would have done. Ruark stood there idly examining the point of one of his short spears. This was Wise One's business, and he always said he did not care what the Wise Ones did, so long as they kept their fingers out of Clan Chief's business. But Taim, he made a show of not caring, folding his arms and looking around the camp with a bored expression. Yet his scent was strange, complex. Perrin would have said the man was amused, definitely in a better humor than before. "The oath we took," Bera said at last, planting her hands on her ample hips, "is sufficient to hold anyone but a dark friend." The twist she gave to oath was almost as bleak as the one she gave dark friend. No, they did not like what they had sworn to. "Do you dare to accuse us? If I thought that," Rand snapped, "you would be on your way to the Black Tower with Taim. You swore to obey. Well, obey!" For a long moment, Bera hesitated, then in an instant was as regal from head to toe as any Aes Sedai could be, which was saying something. An Aes Sedai can make a queen on her throne look a slattern. She curtsied slightly, stiffly inclining her head a fraction. Karuna, on the other hand, made a visible effort to take hold of herself, the calm she assumed hard and brittle as her voice. "Must we then request permission of these worthy Aiel women to ask whether you are willing to be healed yet? I know Galena treated you harshly. I know you are welts from shoulders to knees. Accept healing, please." Even please sounded part of an order. Min stirred at Rand's side. "You should be grateful for it as I was, sheep herder. You don't like hurting. Somebody has to do it, or else..." She grinned mischievously, very nearly the Min Perrin remembered from before she was kidnapped. "Or else you won't be able to sit a saddle." "Young men and fools," Nandera said suddenly to no one in particular, "sometimes bear pain they do not have to as a badge of their pride. And their foolishness." "The Kara Karn," Sulan added dryly, also to the air, "is not a fool. I think." Rand smiled back at Min fondly, and gave Nandera and Sulan wry looks, but when he raised his eyes to Karuna again, they were stone once more. "Very well." As she started forward, he added, "But not from you." Her face grew so stiff it appeared ready to crack. Taim's mouth quirked in a wry, almost smile, and he stepped toward Rand, but without taking his eyes from Karuna, Rand flung out a hand behind him. "From her. Come here, Alana." Perrin gave a start. Rand had pointed straight to Alana with never so much as a glance. That prickled something in the back of his head, but he could not make out what. It seemed to catch Taim as well. The man's face became a bland mask, yet dark eyes flickered between Rand and Alana, and the only name Perrin could put to the scent that writhed in his nose was puzzled. Alana gave a start too. For whatever reason, she had been on edge ever since joining Perrin on his way here, her serenity at best a thin veneer. Now she smoothed her skirts, shot a defiant stare at Karuna and Bera, of all people, and glided around in front of Rand. The other two sisters watched her, like teachers intending to make sure a pupil performed well, and still not convinced she would. Which made no sense. One of them might be the leader, yet Alana was Aes Sedai, the same as they. It all deepened Perrin's suspicion. Mixing with Aes Sedai was too much like wading the streams in the waterwood near to the mire. However peaceful the surface, currents beneath could snatch you off your feet. More undercurrents seemed to appear here every moment, and not all from the sisters. Shockingly, Rand cupped Alana's chin, turning her face up. There was a hiss of indrawn breath from Bera, and for once, Perrin agreed. Rand would not have been so forward with a girl at a dance back home, and Alana was not a girl at a dance. Just as surprising, her reaction was to blush and smell of uncertainty. Aes Sedai did not blush in Perrin's experience, and they were never uncertain. "Heal me," Rand said, a command, not a request. The red in Alana's face deepened, and anger touched her scent. Her hands trembled as she reached up to take his head between them. Unconsciously, Perrin rubbed the palm of his hand, the one Ashido's spear had laid open yesterday. Karuna had healed several gashes in him, and he had had healing before, too. It felt like being plunged headfirst into a freezing pond. It left you gasping and shaking in weak-kneed. Hungry, too, usually. The only sign Rand gave that anything had been done, though, was a slight shiver. "How do you stand the pain?" Alana whispered at him. "It's done, then," he said, removing her hands, and turned from her without a word of thanks. Seeming on the point of speaking, he paused, half turning to look back toward Demise Wells. "They have all been found, Rand al'Thor," Amis said gently. He nodded, then again, more briskly. "It's time to be gone. Soralia, will you name wise ones to take over the prisoners from the Ashaman? And also as companions for Karuna and my other liege women." For an instant, he grinned. "I wouldn't want them to err through ignorance." "It shall be done as you say, Karakarn." Adjusting her shawl firmly, the leather-faced wise one addressed the three sisters. "Join your friends until I can find someone to hold your hands." It was not unexpected that Bera would frown indignantly or Karuna become frost personified. Alana gazed at the ground, resigned, almost sullen. Soralia was having none of it. Clapping her hands sharply, she made brisk shooing motions. "Well, move! Move!" Reluctantly, the Aes Sedai let themselves be herded, making it seem they simply were going where they wished. Joining Soralia, Amis whispered something that Perrin did not quite catch. The three Aes Sedai apparently did, though. They stopped dead. Three very startled faces looking back at the wise ones. Soralia just clapped her hands again, louder than before, and shooed even more briskly. Scratching his beard, Perrin met Ruark's eyes. The clan chief smiled faintly and shrugged. Wise one's business. That was all very well for him. Aiel were fatalistic as wolves. Perrin glanced at Gedwin. The fellow was watching Soralia lecture the Aes Sedai. No, it was the sisters he watched. A fox staring at hens in a coop just out of his reach. The wise ones have to be better than the Ashaman, Perrin thought. They have to be. If Rand noticed the byplay, he ignored it. "Taim, you take the Ashaman back to the Black Tower as soon as the wise ones have charge of the prisoners. As soon as. Remember to keep an eye out for any man who learns too fast. And remember what I said about recruiting." "I can hardly forget, my Lord Dragon," the black-coated man replied dryly. "I will handle that trip personally. But if I may bring it up again, you need a proper honor guard." "We have been over that," Rand said curtly. "I have better uses for the Ashaman. If I need an honor guard, those I am keeping will do." "Perrin, will you—" "My Lord Dragon," Taim broke in, "you need more than a few Ashaman around you." Rand's head turned toward Taim. His face matched any Aes Sedai for giving nothing away, but his scent made Perrin's ears try to lie back. Razor-sharp rage abruptly vanished in curiosity and caution. The one thin and probing, the other fog-like. Then, slashing murderous fury consumed both. Rand shook his head just slightly, and his smell became stony determination. Nobody's scent changed that fast. Nobody's. Taim had only his eyes to go by, of course, and all they could tell him was that Rand had shaken his head, if just barely. "Think. You have chosen 4 dedicated and 4 soldiers. You should have Ashaman." Perrin did not understand that. he thought they were all Ashaman. You think I can't teach them as well as you? Rand's voice was soft, the whisper of a blade sliding in its sheath. I think the Lord Dragon is too busy for teaching, Taim replied smoothly, yet the anger smell rose again. Too important. Take men who need the least of it. I can choose the furthest along. One, Rand cut in, and I will choose. Taim smiled, spreading his hands in acquiescence, but the scent of frustration nearly overwhelmed anger. Again, Rand pointed without looking. Him. This time, he seemed surprised to find he was pointing directly at a man in his middle years, sitting atop an upturned cask on the other side of the wagon circle, paying no attention to the gathering around Rand. Instead, elbow on his knee and chin propped on his hand, he was frowning at the Aes Sedai prisoners. The sword and dragon glittered on the high collar of his black coat. What is his name, Taim? Dashiva, Taim said slowly, studying Rand. He smelled even more surprised than Rand did, and irritated too. Korlan Dashiva, from a farm in the Black Hills. He will do, Rand said, but he did not sound sure himself. Dashiva is gaining his strength rapidly, but his head is in the clouds often as not. Even when it isn't, he is not always entirely there. Maybe he's just a daydreamer, and maybe the taint on Saidin is touching his brain already. Better for you to choose Torval, or Rochade, or... Taim's opposition seemed to sweep away Rand's uncertainty. I said Dashiva will do. Tell him he's to come with me, then turn the prisoners over to the Wise Ones and go. I don't intend to stand here all day arguing. Perrin, ready everyone to move. Find me when they are. Without another word, he strode off, men clinging to his arm, and Nandera and Sulin like shadows. Taim's dark eyes glittered, then he was stalking away himself, shouting for Gedwin and Rochade, Torval, and Kisman. Black-coated men came running. Perrin grimaced. With everything he had to tell Rand, he had not opened his mouth once. At that, maybe it would come better away from the Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones, and Taim. Really, there was not much for him to do. He was supposed to be in charge, since he had brought the rescue, but Ruark knew what needed doing better than he ever would, and a word to Dobrain and Javian was sufficient for the Karianen and Mayanners. They still wanted to say something, though they held back until they were alone and Perrin asked what it was. Then Javian burst out. Lord Perrin, it's the Dragon Reborn. All that searching through the corpses... It seemed a little... excessive, Dobrain interrupted smoothly. We worry for him, as you can understand. A great deal depends on him. He might look a soldier, and he was, but he was a Karianen lord, too, and steeped in the game of houses, with all its careful talk, like any other Karianen. Perrin was not steeped in the game of houses. He's still sane, he said bluntly. Dobrain simply nodded, as if to say of course, shrugged to say he had never intended to question, but Javian went bright red. Watching them go to their men, Perrin shook his head. He hoped he was not lying. Gathering the Two Rivers men, he told them to saddle their horses and ignored all the bowing, most of which looked spur of the moment. Even Fail said that sometimes Two Rivers people carried bowing too far. She said they were still working out how to behave with a lord. He thought about shouting, I am not a lord at them, but he had done that before, and it never worked. When all the others rushed for their animals, Denel Luan and Ban Alcine remained behind. Cousins, both were beanpoles, and they looked much alike, except that Danel affected mustaches like downturned horns in the Terrabarner style, while Ban wore narrow lines of dark hair in the fashion of Arad Doman, beneath a nose like a pickaxe. Refugees had brought a lot of new things into the Two Rivers. Those Ashaman coming with us? Danel asked. When Perrin shook his head, he exhaled so hard in relief that his thick mustaches stirred. What about the Aes Sedai? Ban said anxiously. They'll go free now, won't they? I mean, Rand is free. The Lord Dragon, that is. They can't stay prisoners, not Aes Sedai. You two just have everybody ready to ride, Perrin said. Leave worrying about Aes Sedai to Rand. The pair even winced alike. 2 fingers rose to scratch worriedly at mustaches, and Perrin jerked his hand away from his chin. The man looked as if he had fleas when he did that. The camp was a bustle in no time. Everyone had been expecting to move soon, yet everyone had things left undone. The captive Aes Sedai's servants and wagon drivers hurriedly loaded the last items into the wagons and began hitching teams with a jingle of harness. Karianen and Mayenners seemed to be everywhere, checking saddles and bridles. Unclothed Guy Shine went running every which way, though there did not seem to be much for the Aiel to ready. Flashes of light outside the wagons announced the departure of Taim and the
There we
Ashaman.
go.
That made Perrin feel better. Of the 9 who remained, another besides Jashiva was in his middle years, a stocky fellow with a farmer's face, and one with a limp and a fringe of white hair might easily have been a grandfather. The rest were younger, some little more than boys, yet they watched all the hubbub with the self-possession of men who had seen as much a dozen times. They did keep to themselves, though, and together, except for Jashiva, who stood a few paces apart, staring at nothing. Remembering Taim's caution about the fellow, Perrin hoped he was daydreaming. He found Rand seated on a wooden crate with his elbows on his knees. Sualin and Nandera squatted easily to either side of Rand, both studiously avoiding looking at the sword at his hip. Holding their spears and bullhide bucklers casually, here in the midst of people loyal to Rand, they kept a watch on anything that moved near him. Min sat on the ground at his feet with her legs tucked under, smiling up at him. "I hope you know what you're doing, Rand," Perrin said, shifting the axe haft so he could drop to his heels. No one was close enough to hear except for Rand and Min and the 2 maidens. If Sualin or Nandera went running to the Wise Ones, so be it. Without more preamble, he launched into what he had seen so far this morning. What he had smelled, too, though he did not say that. Rand was not among the few who knew about him and wolves. He made it all seem what he had seen and heard. The Ashaman and the Wise Ones, the Ashaman and the Aes Sedai, the Wise Ones and the Aes Sedai, the whole tangle of tinder that might burst into flame any moment. He did not spare the 2 Rivers men. They're worried, Rand, and if they are sweating, you can be sure some Karianen is thinking about doing something. Or a Tyran. Maybe just helping the prisoners escape. Maybe something worse. Light I could see Danilin Ban and 50 more besides helping them get away, if they knew how. "You think something else would be that much worse?" Rand said quietly, and Perrin's skin prickled. He met Rand's gaze directly. 1,000 times, he said in just as quiet a voice. "I won't be part of murder. If you will be, I'll stand in your way." A silence stretched, unblinking blue-gray eyes meeting unblinking golden. Frowning at each of them in turn, Min made an exasperated sound in her throat. "You 2 bullheads! Rand, you know you'll never give an order like that, or let anyone else give it either. Perrin, you know he won't. Now the pair of you stop acting like 2 strange roosters in a pen." Sualin chuckled, but Perrin wanted to ask Min how certain she was, although that was not a question he could voice here. Rand scrubbed his fingers through his hair, then shook his head, for all the world like a man disagreeing with somebody who was not there. The sort of voice that madmen heard. "It's never easy, is it?" Rand said after a time, looking sad. "The bitter truth is I can't say which would be worse. I don't have any good choices. They saw to that themselves." His face was despondent, but rage boiled in his scent. "Alive or dead, they're a millstone on my back, and either way they could break it." Perrin followed his gaze to the Aes Sedai prisoners. They were on their feet now, and all together, though even so they managed to put a little distance between the 3 who had been stilled and the rest. The Wise Ones around them were being curt with their orders by the gestures they made and the tight faces in the sisters. Maybe the wise ones were better than Rand keeping them too. If only he could be sure. Did you see anything, Min? Rand said. Perrin gave a start and directed a warning glance at Sulin and Nandera, but Min laughed softly. Leaning against Rand's knee, she really did look the Min he knew, for the first time since finding her at the wells. Perrin, they know about me. The wise ones, the maidens, maybe all of them. And they don't care. She had a talent she kept hidden, much as he did the wolves. Sometimes she saw images and auras around people. Sometimes she knew what they meant. You can't know what it's like, Perrin. I was 12 when it started, and I didn't know to make a secret of it. Everybody thought I was just making things up. Until I said a man on the next street was going to marry a woman I saw with him, only he was already married. When he ran off with her, his wife brought a mob to my aunt's house claiming I was responsible, that I'd used the one power on her husband or given the two of them some kind of potion. Min shook her head. She wasn't too clear. She just had to blame somebody. There was talk of me being a dark friend, too. There had been some white cloaks in town earlier, trying to stir people up. Anyway, Aunt Rana convinced me to say I had just overheard them talking, and Aunt Mirren promised to spank me for spreading tales, and Aunt Jan said she'd dose me. They didn't, of course. They knew the truth. But if they hadn't been so matter-of-fact about me just being a child, I could have been hurt or even killed. Most people don't like somebody knowing things about their future. Most people don't really want to know it themselves, not unless it's good anyway. Even my aunts didn't. But to the Aiel, I am sort of a wise one by courtesy. Some can do things others cannot, Nandera said, as if that was enough explanation. Min laughed again and reached out to touch the maiden's knee. Thank you. Settling her feet beneath her, she looked up at Rand. Now that she was laughing again, she seemed radiant. That held even after she became serious. Serious and not very pleased. As for your question, nothing of any use. Taim has blood in his past and blood in his future, but you could guess that. He's a dangerous man. They seem to be gathering images like Aes Sedai. A sidelong look through lowered eyelashes at Dashiva and the other Ashaman said who she meant. Most people had few images around them, but Min said Aes Sedai and warders always did. The problem is, what I can see is all blurry. I think it's because they're holding the power. That often seems true with Aes Sedai, and it's worse when they're actually channeling. Karuna and that lot have all sorts of things around them, but they stay so close together that it all, well, jumbles together most of the time. It's even muddier with the prisoners. Never mind the prisoners, Rand told her. That's what they'll stay. But Rand, I keep feeling there is something important. If I could only make it out. You need to know. If you don't know everything, you must go on with what you do know, Rand quoted wryly. It seems I never do know everything. Hardly enough most of the time. But there's no choice but to go on, is there? That was not at all a question. Loyal strode up, bubbling with energy despite his obvious weariness.
Rand, they say they're ready to go, but you promised to talk to me while it's fresh.
Abruptly, his ears twitched with embarrassment, and that booming voice became plaintive.
I am sorry. I know it can't be enjoyable, but I must know. For the book. For the ages.
Laughing, Rand got to his feet and tugged at the Ogier's open coat. For the ages? Do writers all talk like that? Don't worry, Loyal. It will still be fresh when I tell you. I won't forget. A grim, sour scent flashed from him despite the smile and was gone. But back in Kyrian, after we all have a bath and sleep in a bed. Rand motioned for Dashiva to come closer. The man was not skinny, yet he moved in a hesitant, creeping way, hands folded at his waist, that made him seem so. My Lord Dragon, he said, tilting his head. Can you make a gateway, Dashiva? Of course. Dashiva began dry washing his hands, flicking at his lips with the tip of his tongue, and Perrin wondered whether the man was always this jittery, or just when speaking to the Dragon Reborn. That is to say, the Mahale teaches traveling as soon as a student shows himself strong enough. The Mahale? Rand said, blinking. The Lord Mazrim Taim's title, my Lord Dragon. It means leader, in the old tongue. The fellow's smile managed to be nervous and patronizing at the same time. I read a great deal on the farm. Every book the peddlers brought by. The Mahale, Rand muttered disapprovingly. Well, be that as it may, make me a gateway to near Kyrian, Dashiva. It's time to see what the world has been up to while I was away, and what I have to do about it. He laughed then in a rueful way, but the sound of it made Perrin's skin prickle. Chapter 3. Hill of the Golden Dawn. On a wide, low hilltop some miles north and east of the city of Kyrian, well away from any road or human habitation, a thin vertical slash of pure light appeared, taller than a man on a horse. The ground sloped away in every direction, undulating gently. Nothing more than occasional brush obscured the view for more than a mile, all the way to the surrounding forest. Brown grass fell as the light seemed to rotate, widening into a square opening in midair. A number of the dead stems were slit lengthwise, sliced finer than any razor could have, by a hole in the air. The instant the gateway was fully open, veiled Aiel poured out, men and maidens spreading in every direction to encircle the hill. Almost hidden in the torrent, 4 sharp-eyed Ashaman took up positions around the gateway itself, peering toward the encircling woodland. Nothing stirred except with the wind, dust, tall grass, and branches in the distance. Yet each Ashaman studied the vista with the fervor of a starving hawk searching for a rabbit. A rabbit watching for a hawk might have been his intent, but never with that air of menace. There was really no break in the flow. One moment it was a flood of Aiel, the next mounted Kyrianan armsmen galloping out 2 by 2, the crimson banner of light going up at their head as soon as it cleared the gateway. Without a pause, Dobrain drew his men aside and began forming them up a little down the slope, helmeted and gauntleted in precise ranks, lances raised to the same angle. Seasoned campaigners, they were ready to wheel and charge in any direction at his gesture. On the heels of the last Kyrianan, Perrin rode stepper through, the dun passing in one stride from the hill below Dumai's Wells to the hill in Kyrian, and ducked in spite of himself. The upper edge of the thing stood well above his head, but he had seen the damage a gateway could do, and had no wish to test whether they were safer standing still. Loyal and Daram followed close behind. The Ogier afoot with his long-hafted axe on his shoulder bent his knees. And then the 2 Rivers men, crouching on their saddles well beyond the gateway. Rad al-Dai carried the red wolf head banner, Perrin's, because everyone said it was, and Tel Luan the red eagle. Perrin tried not to look at those, especially the red eagle banners. They never vanished for long. The red wolf had named him something he was not, and did not want to be, while the red eagle... More than 2,000 years after Manetheren died in the Trolloc Wars, close to 1,000 after Andor swallowed part of what once had been Manetheren, that banner was still as good as an act of rebellion for an Anderman. Legends still walked in some men's minds. Of course, it had been a few generations since 2 Rivers folk had had any notion that they were Andermen, but Queen's minds did not change so easily. He had met the new Queen of Andor, what seemed a long time ago, in the Stone of Tyr. She had not been queen then, and was not yet really until she was crowned in Caemlyn. But Elaine seemed a pleasant young woman, and pretty, though he was not partial to fair-haired women. A bit taken with herself, of course, as daughter heir. Taken with Rand, too, if snuggling in corners meant anything. Rand wanted to give her not only the Lion Throne of Andor, but the Sun Throne of Kyrian. Surely she would be grateful enough to let the flying of a flag pass when it did not really mean anything. Watching the 2 Rivers men deploy behind those banners, Perrin shook his head. It was a worry for another day, in any case. There was nothing like armsman's precision in the Two Rivers men, most boys like Todd, farmers' sons and shepherds, yet they knew what to do. Every fifth man took the reins of 4 more horses, while the other riders hurriedly dismounted, longbows already strung and in hand. Those on the ground straggled together in rough lines, looking around with more interest than anything else, but they checked their quivers with practiced gestures and handled their bows with familiarity. The great Two Rivers bows, even when strung, nearly as tall as the men who drew them. With those bows, not a man of them but could shoot farther than anyone outside the Two Rivers would believe, and hit what he aimed at. Perrin hoped there would be none of that today. Sometimes he dreamed of a world where there never was. And Rand? Do you believe my enemies have been asleep while I was away? Rand had said suddenly as they stood waiting for Dashiva to open the gateway. He had on a coat rooted out of the wagons, well-cut green wool, but hardly what he usually wore now. Short of taking the coat off a warder's back or a cotton sore from an Aielman, it was the only garment in the camp to fit him. Truth, he would have thought he insisted on silk and fine embroidery, the way he had had those wagons searched top to bottom yesterday and this morning. The wagons stretched out in line, teams hitched, canvas covers and iron hoops taken down. Karuna and the rest of the Sworn Sisters sat packed into the head wagon and not happy. They had ceased their protests as soon as they saw that protesting did no good, but Perrin could still hear coldly angry mutters. At least they rode. Their warders surrounded the wagon afoot, silent and stony, while the Aes Sedai prisoners stood in a rigid, sullen cluster ringed by every wise one who was not with Rand, which was to say all but Soralea and Amis. The prisoners' warders glowered in another clump 100 paces off, cold death waiting despite their injuries and Siswayam guards. Except for Karuna's big black, its reins held by Rand, and a mouse-colored mare with fine ankles for Min, the Aes Sedai's and warders' horses not assigned to Ashaman, or used to fill out wagon teams, that had caused a commotion worse than making their owners walk, were all tied to long lead lines fastened to the wagon's tailgates. Do you believe it, Flynn? Grady? One of the Ashaman waiting to go through first, the stocky fellow with a farmer's face, looked at Rand uncertainly, then at the leathery old man with the limp. Each wore a silver sword pin on his collar, but not the dragon. Only a fool thinks his enemies stand still when he isn't looking, my Lord Dragon, the old man said in a gruff voice. He sounded like a soldier. What about you, Dashiva? Dashiva gave a start, surprised to be addressed. I grew up on a farm. He tugged his sword belt straight, which it did not need. Supposedly they trained with the swords as much as with the power, but Dashiva did not seem to know one end from the other. I don't know much about having enemies. Despite his awkwardness, there was a kind of insolence to him. But then the whole lot seemed weaned on arrogance. If you stay near me, Rand said softly, you will. His smile made Perrin shiver. He smiled while he gave orders to go through the gateway, as though they would be attacked on the other side. There were enemies everywhere, he told them. Always remember that. There were enemies everywhere, and you never knew who. The exodus continued unabated. Wagons rumbled from Dumai's Wells to Kyrian, the sisters in the first like statues of ice being lurched about. Their warders trotted alongside, hands gripping sword hilts and eyes never resting on one spot. Clearly they thought their Aes Sedai needed protection, as much from those already on the hill as from anyone who might appear. The wise ones marched through, herding their charges. A number used sticks to prod the Aes Sedai along, though the sisters made a good job pretending there were neither wise ones nor prods. The Shido Gaishain came, trotting in a column 4 wide under the gaze of a single maiden. She pointed to a place out of the way before darting to join the other Fardarais Mai, and the Gaishain knelt there in lines, naked as jaybirds and proud as eagles. The remaining warders followed under their guard, radiating a massed fury that Perrin could smell over everything else. Then Ruark with the rest of the Siswayaman and maidens, and 4 more Ashaman, each leading a second horse for one of the first 4, and Narella and his wing guards with their red-streamered lances. The Mayenners were puffed up over being the rear guard, laughing and shouting boasts to the Karienen of what they would have done had the Shido returned. Though in fact, they were not last. Last of all came Rand on Karuna's gelding and Min on her mare. Soralia and Amis strode along to one side of the tall black horse, then Dara and half a dozen maidens to the other, and Dashiva led a placid-looking bay mare at their heels. The gateway winked out, and Dashiva blinked at where it had been, smiling faintly, then scrambled clumsily into the mare's saddle. He seemed to be talking to himself, but it was probably because his sword tangled in his legs, and he nearly fell. Surely he was not mad already. An army covered the hill, all arrayed for an attack that plainly was not coming. A small army, only a few thousand, though it would have seemed fair-sized before the Aiel brought their numbers across the dragon wall. Guiding his horse slowly toward Perrin, Rand scanned the countryside. The 2 wise ones followed closely, talking softly and watching him. Then Dara and the maidens followed, watching everything else. Had Rand been a wolf, Perrin would have said he was testing the air. He carried the dragon scepter across his high saddle bow, a 2-foot length of spear decorated with a green and white tassel and carved with dragons, and now and then weighed it lightly in his hand as if to remind himself of it. When Rand reined in, he studied Perrin as intently as he had the surrounding country. "I trust you," he said finally, nodding. Min stirred in her saddle, and he added, "And you, Min, of course. And you too, Loyal." The Ogier shifted uncertainly, with a hesitant glance for Perrin. Rand looked around the hillside, at the Aiel, and the Ashaman, and all the rest. "So few I can trust," he whispered tiredly. His scent was jumbled enough for 2 men, anger and fear, determination and despair. And woven through it all, weariness. "Be sane," Perrin wanted to tell him. "Hold on." A wash of guilt held his tongue, though. Because it was the Dragon Reborn he wanted to say it to, not his friend since childhood. He wanted his friend to stay sane. The Dragon Reborn had to stay sane. "My Lord Dragon!" one of the Ashaman called abruptly. He looked little more than a boy, with dark eyes as big as any girl's, and neither sword nor dragon on his collar, but pride in his bearing. "Narishma," Perrin had heard him called. "To the southwest." A figure had appeared, running out from the trees a mile or more away. A woman with skirts hiked to her thighs. To Perrin's eyes, she was clearly Aiel. A wise one, he thought, though there was no real way to tell at sight. He was just certain. The sight of her brought back all his edginess. Somebody out here, just where they happened to come out of the gateway, could not be good news. The Shido had been troubling Kyrian again when he set off after Rand. But to the Aiel, a wise one was a wise one, whatever her clan. They visited like neighbors over tea while their clans killed one another. 2 Aiel trying to kill each other would step back to let a wise one pass between. Maybe yesterday had changed that, and maybe not. He exhaled wearily. At best, she could not be good news. Nearly everyone on the hill seemed to feel the same. Ripples of motion ran everywhere, spears hefted, arrows knocked. Karienen and Mayenners shifted in their saddles, and Aram drew his sword, eyes shining with anticipation. Loyal leaned on his tall axe and fingered the edge regretfully. The head was shaped like that of a huge wood axe, but engraved with leaves and scrolls, and inlaid with gold. The inlay was a trifle scuffed from the axe's late use. If he had to use it again, he would, but with as much reluctance as Perrin used his, and for many of the same reasons. Rand simply sat his horse and watched, face unreadable. Min edged her mare close enough to stroke his shoulder, like someone trying to soothe a mastiff with its hackles up. The wise ones also gave no sign of disturbance, but neither did they stay still. Soralia gestured, and a dozen of the women guarding the Aes Sedai broke off to join her and Amis, well away from them, out of even Perrin's hearing. Few had any gray in their hair, and Soralea's was the only lined face, but then there was hardly a gray hair to be seen on any of the wise ones here. The fact was, not many Aiel lived to have much gray hair. These women had position, though, or influence, however wise ones decided such things. Perrin had seen Soralea and Amis confer with the same lot before, though confer was not quite the word. Soralea spoke, with an occasional word from Amis, and the others listened. Idara raised a protest, but Soralea smothered it, apparently without breaking stride, then pointed out two of their number, Sartarin and Kosain. Immediately, they gathered their skirts over their arms and sped off toward the newcomer, legs flashing. Perrin patted Stepper's neck. No more killing. Not yet. The three wise ones met nearly half a mile from the hill and stopped. They spoke, just for a moment, and then all came on at a run, back to the hill, and straight to Soralea. The newcomer, a youngish, long-nosed woman with a mass of incredibly red hair, spoke hurriedly. Soralea's face grew stonier by the word. Finally, the red-haired woman finished, or rather Soralea cut her short with a few words, and the lot turned to face Rand. None made a move toward him, though. They waited, hands folded at their waists and shawls looped over their arms, inscrutable as any Aes Sedai. The Kara Karn, Rand muttered dryly under his breath. Swinging a leg over, he slid from his saddle, then helped Min to the ground. Perrin climbed down too and led Stepper after them to the wise ones. Loyal trailed along, and Aram followed on his horse, not dismounting
Hey,
until
big
Perrin
movie fan,
motioned
how
him
you
to.
doing?
Aiel did not ride, not unless it was absolutely necessary anyway, and they considered it rude for anyone to face them from horseback. Ruark joined them, and Gaul, who wore a scowl for some reason. It went without saying that Nandera and Sulan and the maidens came too. The red-haired newcomer began as soon as Rand drew near. Baron Regana set watches every way you might possibly come back to the Tree-Killer City, Karakan. But in truth, no one thought this would be... Paragon, Soralea said, sharply enough to draw blood. The red-haired woman's teeth clicked as she snapped her mouth shut, and she stared fixedly at Rand with brilliant blue eyes, avoiding Soralea's glare. Finally, Soralea took a breath and turned her attention to Rand. There is trouble in the tents, she said in a flat voice. Rumors began among the tree killers that you have gone to the White Tower with the Aes Sedai who came. Gone to bend knee to the Amalek. None who know the truth dared to speak, or the result would have been worse. And what is the result? Rand asked quietly. He exuded tension, and Min began stroking his shoulder again. Many believe you have abandoned the Aiel, Amis told him just as quietly. The bleakness has returned. Every day 1,000 or more throw down their spears and vanish, unable to face our future or our past. Some may be going to the tower. For a moment, disgust came to her voice. There have been whispers that the true Karakan would not give himself to the Aes Sedai. Indirian says if you have gone to the White Tower, it cannot be willingly. He is ready to take the Kodara north, to Tarvalon, and dance the spears with any Aes Sedai he finds. Or any wetlander. He says he must have been betrayed. Timolen mutters that if the tales are true, you have betrayed us, and he will take the Miagoma back to the Threefold Land. After he sees you dead.
No, that sucks.
Mandalane and Janwin hold their counsel, but they listen to Indirian and Timolen both. He grimaced, sucking air between his teeth. For an Aiel, it was as much as tearing his hair in despair. It's not good news, Perrin protested, but you make it sound a death sentence. Once Rand shows himself, the rumors are done. Rand scrubbed a hand through his hair. If that was so, Soralea wouldn't look like she had swallowed a lizard. For that matter, Nandera and Sulan looked as though their lizards were still alive on the way down. What haven't you told me yet, Soralea? The leather-faced woman gave him a thin, approving smile. You see beyond what is said. Good. Her tone stayed flat as worked stone, though. You return with Aes Sedai. Some will believe that means you did bend knee. Whatever you say or do, they will believe you wear an Aes Sedai halter. And that is before it is known you are a prisoner. Secrets find crevices a flea could not slip through.
That's all nice and clean
And
now.
a secret known by so many is wings. Perrin eyed Dobrain and
Yeah, but
Rulana,
that sucks they
watching
do that
as
big
they
movie
ran, and
fast.
swallowed queasily.
Me, Halloween's always been a
How many of those who
favorite
followed
holiday of
Rand
mine.
did so because he had the weight of the Aiel masked behind him? Not all, certainly, but for every man who had chosen because Rand was the Dragon Reborn, 5 or even 10 because the light shone brightest on the strongest ranks. If the Aiel broke away, or splintered... He did not want to think about that possibility. Defending the two rivers had stretched his abilities as far as they would go, maybe farther. To Viren or not, he had no illusions he was one of those men who ended up in the histories. That was for
Alright,
Rand.
everyone, I'm gonna call into his life.
Village-sized
tonight.
problems were his limit. Yet he
I'm
could
not
not
feeling
help
too
himself.
good, and
His
my
mind
back's
churned.
killing me, so
What to do if the worst
I
came?
want to thank everyone for stopping by,
Lists
and
ran
everyone
up in his
continues
head.
to stop by.
Who would remain loyal?
I definitely appreciate all
Who
y'all's
might try to
support.
slip away?